Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of United States. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested to know how far and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. The auction block at Johnson Square was unusually crowded that spring morning in 1846. Savannah's elite had gathered, parasols and handkerchiefs in hand, to shield themselves from both the Georgia heat and the stench of unwashed bodies. Elizabeth Mount stood apart from the crowd, her mourning dress a stark contrast against the white linen suits and colorful gowns around her. 6 months a widow, she had finally emerged from seclusion, not for social calls or church services, but for a more practical matter. The Mount Plantation, 7 miles outside Savannah proper, required working hands, and Elizabeth required someone strong enough to manage the tobacco fields her late husband had left in disarray. The auctioneer's voice carried across the square as he presented each lot, human bodies described in terms of muscle, teeth, and breeding potential. Elizabeth observed with clinical detachment, her gloved hands clutching a small leather notebook where she had been calculating figures since dawn. Her inheritance was substantial but not infinite, and every purchase required careful consideration. When Lot 17 was brought forward, a curious silence fell over the crowd. The man stood tall, shoulders squared, despite the iron shackles that bound his wrists. His skin was darker than most, almost blue-black in the morning light, and unusual scars, thin, precise lines, decorated his chest in patterns that seemed intentional rather than the result of punishment. But it was his eyes that caused the murmurs among the crowd. They were a startling amber color, and unlike the downcast gaze of the others before him, this man looked directly ahead, his expression neither defiant nor submissive, but unnervingly aware. Next we have a prime field hand, answers to Isaiah, age approximately 30 years, called the auctioneer, his voice slightly less enthusiastic than before. Strong back, good teeth, no visible ailments, trained in tobacco cultivation. The auctioneer paused, then added with unusual candor, previous owner deceased, sold as part of estate liquidation. Elizabeth noticed how the gathered men shifted uncomfortably, how their wives whispered behind fans. No one raised a paddle when the bidding opened. The auctioneer called again, lowering the starting price. Still, no response. Elizabeth studied the man called Isaiah more carefully. His posture suggested strength, exactly what her neglected fields required. His demeanor suggested intelligence, a valuable trait if properly directed. $200, Elizabeth called out, her voice clear and steady. The auctioneer looked relieved. 200 from Mrs. Mount. Do I hear 250? The silence that followed was telling. No competing bids. The other buyers avoided looking at both Elizabeth and the slave on the block. Going once, twice, sold to Mrs. Elizabeth Mount for $200. Only as she approached to complete the paperwork did she hear the whispered warning from Mrs. Harrington, the banker's wife. You should know, Lizzie, that's the 3rd time he's been sold in 2 years. Each previous master met with unfortunate circumstances. Elizabeth merely smiled. I appreciate your concern, Margaret, but I'm not one for superstition. Besides, at that price he was quite the bargain. What Elizabeth Mount couldn't possibly know as she signed the bill of sale was that she had just made the most catastrophic decision of her privileged life. The papers identifying Isaiah Boone as her property would later be found in the investigations of 1848, becoming part of the public record that documented what locals came to call the Mount Plantation incident. The carriage ride to Mount Plantation was conducted in silence. Elizabeth sat upright, her back never touching the cushioned seat, while Isaiah rode on the rear platform, his newly purchased body swaying with the vehicle's motion over rutted dirt roads. The plantation house appeared on the horizon. a once grand Georgian structure with imposing columns and wide verandas. But 6 months of minimal care had left the white paint peeling and the gardens overgrown. Even from a distance, the tobacco fields showed signs of neglect. As they approached, Elizabeth spoke without turning her head. "My husband, Colonel Mount, passed in November. The overseer left shortly after, taking 3 of our best hands with him. The remaining slaves are mostly house servants or too old for field work." Her tone was matter-of-fact, as though discussing the weather rather than the upheaval of human lives. "You come with experience in tobacco. You will be responsible for the fields and the 4 field hands we still have. You will report directly to me, not to the house slaves." Isaiah's response was a single nod, visible to Elizabeth only in her peripheral vision. She continued, "You'll be housed in the cabin by the northern field edge. It's separate from the others. Previous occupant was the former overseer. I'll expect work to begin at dawn tomorrow." When the carriage stopped before the main house, Elizabeth descended without assistance. "Malachi will show you to your quarters and provide you with necessary items," she said, gesturing to an elderly black man who had appeared from around the side of the house. "I expect you at the main house at 7 o'clock to discuss the condition of the fields." That evening, as recorded in Elizabeth Mount's diary, later recovered from a floorboard cavity during the investigation, she wrote, "Acquired new field hand today. Isaiah, approximately 30, unusual in appearance but promising in capability. Paid significantly under market value, which raises some concern as to his character or health, though he appears sound in body. Margaret Harrington attempted to dissuade me with ghost stories about his previous owners, but such provincial superstition is beneath consideration. Tomorrow we shall see if my investment proves worthwhile." What the diary didn't record was the conversation that took place in the kitchen that same evening, documented years later through interviews with Malachi's daughter, Sarah, who had been 12 years old at the time. "That one ain't right," Malachi had whispered to the cook, Bessie, as they prepared Elizabeth's evening meal. "Saw them marks on his chest. Those ain't whipping scars. Those are ritual marks from the old country. My grandmama told me about men who carried such markings, said they weren't entirely of this world." "Hush such talk," Bessie had replied, though her hands trembled slightly as she kneaded dough. "Missy's already in a state since the colonel passed." "Don't need no conjure talk stirring up more trouble." Sarah would later recall how her father had lowered his voice further. "Heard things at the market. That man been sold 3 times since coming to Georgia. First master was found in his bed, eyes open but seeing nothing. Second one walked into the Savannah River at midnight, fully dressed in his Sunday best, never struggled even as he went under. Third one shot himself in his study with no explanation. And after each death, that man Isaiah was sold off quick and quiet." The household staff watched from windows when, at 7 o'clock precisely, Isaiah approached the main house. His gait was smooth, unhurried, his posture straight despite the day's journey. Elizabeth received him in her husband's former study, a room she had claimed as her own since his death, replacing hunting trophies with botanical illustrations and reorganizing the plantation ledgers according to her own meticulous system. "The tobacco crop is failing," she stated without preamble. "The soil needs attention. The remaining hands lack direction." She pushed a hand-drawn map across the desk. "This shows the field divisions. I've marked where the problems seem most severe." Isaiah studied the map silently, then spoke for the first time, his voice deeper than she had expected, his diction more precise than she had presumed. "The rotation is wrong," he said, pointing to sections of the map. "Tobacco depletes soil. These fields should have been planted with legumes last season to restore nutrients." He continued with a detailed analysis that revealed not just practical knowledge, but scientific understanding of agriculture that surprised Elizabeth. Her diary that night contained a longer entry. Isaiah demonstrated unexpected intelligence regarding crop rotation and soil management, speaks with unusual clarity and knowledge for one of his station. has recommended significant changes to our planting strategy. I find myself inclined to grant him the authority to implement these changes, despite the unconventional nature of placing such decisions in the hands of a slave. Economic necessity must sometimes override social convention. Within 2 weeks, changes at Mount Plantation became noticeable. Under Isaiah's direction, the field hands worked with renewed purpose. Elizabeth, who had taken to observing from the upstairs gallery each morning, noted how differently they responded to him compared to her late husband's methods of shouted commands and threatened punishments. Isaiah spoke quietly, demonstrated techniques personally, and divided labor according to individual strengths rather than arbitrary assignments. More curious to Elizabeth was how the house servants reacted to his presence. They avoided him when possible, and when interaction was necessary, they kept their eyes lowered, not in the manner of showing proper deference to authority, but as though afraid to meet his gaze directly. Only Malachi seemed willing to engage with Isaiah, though their conversations, conducted in hushed tones on the back porch during evenings, ceased whenever anyone approached. By early June, the first signs of the tobacco crop's recovery were evident. Elizabeth recorded her satisfaction in her diary, along with observations that became increasingly focused on Isaiah himself. His methods prove effective. The fields show marked improvement. I find myself watching his movements from the window of the study. The efficiency with which he works, the quiet authority he commands. There is an unusual grace to him that belies his station. Last night, I dreamed of those strange markings on his chest. In the dream, they seemed to form words in a language I almost understood. It was around this time that Elizabeth began to invite Isaiah to the main house more frequently, ostensibly to report on the plantation's progress. These meetings, initially conducted in the formal setting of the study with the door open, as propriety demanded, gradually shifted to the more intimate space of the conservatory Elizabeth had established in the East Wing, a room filled with exotic plants her husband had considered a frivolous waste of space. Between pressed leaves of her diary, investigators would later find dried specimens of unusual plants, carefully labeled in Elizabeth's handwriting, with notes indicating they had been provided by IB. The only reference to Isaiah that didn't use his full name, a small but significant intimacy in the formal language of her journal. The first indication that something had fundamentally changed came in late June. Sarah, now serving as Elizabeth's personal maid, following her previous maid's sudden departure, citing illness, though rumor suggested she had fled after witnessing something disturbing, reported overhearing Elizabeth and Isaiah in the conservatory. Their conversation, conducted in low voices, had included references to the old ways and knowledge from across the water. When Sarah entered the room, she found Elizabeth examining one of the ritual scars on Isaiah's exposed forearm, her gloves removed, her fingers tracing the pattern with an expression Sarah described as hungry. On the 1st of July, 1846, Elizabeth made an unprecedented decision. She recorded it dispassionately in her ledger, relieved Malachi of his duties as head of household staff, position reassigned to Isaiah, who will maintain oversight of field operations while assuming responsibility for domestic affairs. Efficiency demands centralized authority. The household staff received this announcement with shocked silence. That night, 2 of the younger house slaves disappeared, fleeing despite the severe penalties for runaways. They were never recovered. Isaiah now moved between field and house with formal authority, though he continued to reside in the isolated cabin. Elizabeth's diary entries became both more frequent and more cryptic during this period. IB has shown me the meaning behind certain patterns, the knowledge preserved in flesh and memory, passed down from those who understood the world's true nature. The colonel never suspected what power lay dormant in this land, power that requires only the proper direction to manifest. And later, we have begun preparations. The soil must be prepared, just as minds must be prepared. IB says I have natural aptitude. My hands no longer tremble when drawing the symbols. By August, Mount Plantation had become increasingly isolated from neighboring estates. Elizabeth declined all invitations, cited illness when visitors called, and conducted business through written correspondence rather than personal meetings. Deliveries were left at the property gates rather than brought to the house as before. The tobacco crop flourished with unnatural vigor. Plants grew to heights that caused comment among the few outsiders who observed them from the road. The vibrant green of the leaves seemed almost luminous in certain lights, particularly at dusk. A sickly sweet scent hung over the plantation, noticeable from half a mile away. In her final diary entry, dated September 23, 1846, Elizabeth wrote, "Tonight we complete what was begun centuries ago in another land, interrupted by chains and ships and the severance of sacred connections. IB says the alignment is perfect, the moon, the stars, the flow of energies through Earth's veins. What the colonels sought to dominate through brutality, I have cultivated through understanding. The tobacco has absorbed what was offered. When burned, it will open the pathway." The events of that night were pieced together much later, primarily through the reluctant testimony of Sarah, who had hidden in a linen closet after delivering evening tea to Elizabeth's room. From her concealed position, she observed Elizabeth and Isaiah walking together toward the main tobacco field. Elizabeth now dressed in a simple white shift rather than her usual formal attire, her hair loose around her shoulders. They carried a brass bowl that gleamed in the moonlight. What happened in the field remained mostly conjecture, as Sarah did not follow them outside. She reported hearing chanting that made the air feel wrong and seeing flashes of blue light from the direction of the tobacco field. Shortly before midnight, every dog within miles began howling simultaneously. The household staff, already uneasy, barricaded themselves in the kitchen. At dawn, when no orders came from the main house, Malachi finally ventured out to investigate. He found the tobacco field transformed, plants withered and blackened, as though struck by impossible frost in the Georgia summer, the soil beneath them stained dark. Of Elizabeth and Isaiah, there was no immediate sign. It was only after authorities were finally summoned by a delivery man who reported no response at the plantation for 3 days that a proper search was conducted. Elizabeth Mount was discovered in the cellar of the main house, sitting in a chair with her diary open in her lap. According to official reports, she was alive but unresponsive, her eyes open but perceiving nothing, her body maintaining basic functions but her mind apparently absent. She did not react to stimuli, spoke no words, and recognized no one. The examining physician noted in his report that her pulse is steady, her breathing regular, but the essential quality of personhood seems to have been extracted. Isaiah Boone was never found. In the subsequent investigation, several disturbing details emerged. The tobacco crop, despite its blighted appearance, was harvested by order of Elizabeth's cousin and heir, who arrived from Charleston to manage the estate. Against local advice, he sold the tobacco to markets in Savannah and beyond. In the months that followed, physicians in Georgia, South Carolina, and as far north as Virginia reported cases of unusual delirium among those known to smoke Mount Plantation tobacco. Symptoms included vivid hallucinations, speaking in unknown languages, and in several documented cases, individuals claiming to be someone else entirely, someone with memories of the old country across the water. Elizabeth Mount remained institutionalized until her death 17 years later in 1863, during the height of the Civil War. She never spoke again, though nurses reported that in her final years she would sometimes trace patterns on her arms that resembled the ritual scars witnesses had described on Isaiah. The Mount Plantation itself was abandoned after 1850, when a fire of undetermined origin destroyed the main house. The land remained uncultivated, with locals refusing to work the soil. Maps from 1868 show the area simply marked as unsuitable for agriculture. In 1922, when the Georgia Historical Society attempted to document the case as part of a larger study of unusual events in Savannah's history, they discovered that most official records had been expunged or altered. The diary pages quoted in this account were preserved only because the original investigator, Sheriff William Harrington, husband of the same Margaret Harrington who had warned Elizabeth at the auction, had privately copied sections before the originals mysteriously disappeared from evidence storage. Perhaps most unsettling is the account from 1967, when construction began on a housing development on land that once formed part of Mount Plantation. During excavation, workers uncovered a sealed ceramic jar containing soil that was described as unusually dark and oily. Within days, 3 workers developed an identical marking on their forearms, thin, precise scars in patterns that one supervisor, who had spent time in West Africa with the Peace Corps, identified as resembling Adinkra symbols used by certain tribes in Ghana. The housing project was never completed. The land remains vacant to this day. Periodically, reports emerge from the area of a tall figure seen walking the perimeter at dusk, a dark-skinned man in outdated clothing who vanishes when approached. And even more troubling are the occasional accounts of a woman in white who appears at the property's edge, her eyes open but unseeing, her mouth moving as though speaking words only she can hear. The most recent documented sighting occurred in 1968, when a graduate student researching the history of slavery in coastal Georgia attempted to camp on the former plantation grounds. He was found the next morning by highway patrol, wandering along Route 17, disoriented and feverish. Before being sedated at Savannah Memorial Hospital, he repeatedly told doctors that she's still looking for him and that the tobacco remembers what it was fed. To this day, certain older residents of Chatham County refuse to discuss Mount Plantation. When pressed, they offer only the same warning: some bargains cost more than the price paid at auction, and some knowledge, once obtained, cannot be unlearned. In the archives of the Georgia Historical Society, a single page remains from Elizabeth Mount's diary, overlooked during the apparent purge of records. It contains just one line, written in handwriting notably different from her usual precise script. "He is not in me, I am in him." The vessel changes, but the essence remains. The case remains officially unsolved. What few records have survived suggest that in the weeks before that fateful September night, Elizabeth's transformation was more complete than most realized. House servants reported that she had taken to wandering the plantation grounds at night, barefoot and dressed only in her nightclothes, returning at dawn with soil-stained feet and fragments of unfamiliar plants clutched in her hands. Her correspondence, previously maintained with meticulous attention to social convention, ceased entirely. The last letter she wrote was to her sister in Charleston, declining an invitation to spend Christmas with the family. That letter, preserved by her sister and later donated to the Savannah Historical Society in 1932, contained an unsettling postscript. "I have found a purpose that transcends the petty concerns of our society. What Thomas sought through domination, I have discovered through submission to older and wiser ways. Do not attempt to contact me again. By the time you read this, I will no longer be the sister you knew." According to testimony from Bessie, the plantation cook, Elizabeth had stopped eating meals prepared in the kitchen by mid-August. Instead, Isaiah brought her unusual roots and berries, harvested from the surrounding forests and swamplands. Bessie recalled seeing a clay pot perpetually simmering in Elizabeth's private quarters, producing a steam that smelled like the breath of something that feeds on decay. When Bessie attempted to dispose of the mixture during cleaning, she found her hands covered in a rash that left permanent discoloration on her skin. Perhaps most disturbing were the changes in the land itself. Contemporary accounts describe how the plantation's boundaries seemed to shift in subtle ways, with landmarks appearing in unexpected places. The creek that ran along the eastern edge of the property changed course over a matter of weeks, rather than the years such natural alterations should require. Hunters reported disorientation when passing near the Mount property, with several experienced woodsmen becoming inexplicably lost in terrain they had known since childhood. The tobacco crop's unnatural vitality was accompanied by more sinister changes in the local wildlife. Birds were found dead around the fields, their bodies contorted and eyes clouded white. Several farm animals from neighboring properties went missing, only to be discovered weeks later on Mount land, alive but behaving strangely, refusing food, standing motionless for hours, or making sounds that their owners described as almost like human speech, but in no language I ever heard. By early September, the remaining house slaves worked in a state of constant fear. Sarah later testified that they had taken to wearing small pouches of salt and iron nails around their necks, protective charms passed down from African traditions that predated their enslavement. Malachi insisted that no one venture out alone after sunset, and windows were lined with dried herbs believed to ward off malevolent influences. It was during this period that Elizabeth began the most disturbing practice of all, one documented only in Malachi's deathbed confession to his daughter in 1871, long after he had escaped north during the chaos of the Civil War. According to his account, Elizabeth had begun collecting blood from the household members, a few drops at a time, extracted during their sleep with such skill that most never realized it had happened. The blood was apparently added to the soil around certain tobacco plants that had been specially marked with symbols carved into their stems. Those plants grew taller than a man, Malachi had whispered to Sarah. Their leaves were veined with red, and when the wind blew through them, they sounded like whispered names. The investigation conducted after Elizabeth was found in her cataleptic state was notably brief and superficial. Modern scholars, reviewing what documentation remains, have noted several suspicious elements. The lead investigator was a cousin of Colonel Mount's business partner. Several witness statements appear to have been altered after initial recording, and the medical examiner who evaluated Elizabeth was later committed to an asylum himself, reportedly after becoming obsessed with recreating the conditions that had caused her condition. One of the few forthright assessments came from Dr. Jonathan Merritt, a physician with the Georgia State Hospital who examined Elizabeth in 1858, 12 years after the incident. His report, marked confidential, and discovered only when his personal papers were donated to the Medical College of Georgia in 1924, stated, "Mrs. Mount presents the most extraordinary case of consciousness displacement I have encountered in 30 years of medical practice. While her body lives, her essential self appears entirely absent. More disturbing is the occasional impression that something else occupies the vacant space where her mind once resided. Something that watches from behind her eyes with calculated patience, waiting for an opportunity." The fate of Isaiah Boone remains the central mystery of the Mount Plantation incident. No body was ever recovered, and no sightings were reliably documented after that September night. However, in the decades that followed, reports emerged from port cities along the eastern seaboard, Charleston, Norfolk, Baltimore, even as far north as Boston, of a charismatic preacher who appeared suddenly among the free black communities, conducted ceremonies that blended Christian symbolism with older African traditions, and disappeared just as unexpectedly, often following incidents of unexplained deaths or disappearances among prominent white citizens. Descriptions of this figure varied, but certain elements remained consistent: unusually dark skin, amber eyes, and ritual scarification visible when he rolled up his sleeves during particularly intense sermons. Most accounts mentioned his extraordinary eloquence and his message, which centered not on heavenly salvation, but on reclaiming power through connection to ancestral knowledge. In 1861, a Baltimore police report documented the arrest of a man matching this description on charges of inciting unrest. The suspect was detained overnight but found missing from his locked cell the following morning. The officer on duty reported smelling tobacco smoke just before discovering the empty cell, though no one had entered the detention area and no smoking materials were permitted inside. A more verifiable connection emerged in 1878, when a small leather-bound book was discovered during renovations to a former boarding house in Philadelphia that had served as a station on the Underground Railroad. The book contained detailed botanical illustrations and notes on the preparation of various plant compounds, many native to West Africa rather than North America. Interspersed with these practical instructions were philosophical passages about the nature of consciousness, the permeability of boundaries between mind and body, and the concept of spiritual transference. The final page bore a single inscription: I.B. from the soil of Mount, now free in all ways that matter. Handwriting analysis conducted by the University of Pennsylvania in 1943 confirmed that certain marginal notes in the book matched samples of Elizabeth Mount's handwriting from her confirmed correspondence, while the main text was written by an unidentified hand. The tobacco harvested from Mount Plantation in the autumn of 1846 has its own disturbing legacy. Despite its blighted appearance, it was sold through normal commercial channels, primarily to markets in Savannah, Charleston, and Richmond. By spring of 1847, physicians throughout the region were documenting cases of what one doctor termed tobacco madness, a condition affecting primarily wealthy white men who could afford the premium tobacco that Mount Plantation had once been known for producing. Symptoms progressed through distinct stages. First, unusually vivid dreams featuring unfamiliar landscapes. Then, spontaneous utterances in languages the afflicted had never studied. And finally, periods of complete personality transformation, during which victims claimed to be specific other people, often describing in detail lives lived in West African villages before capture and enslavement. These episodes initially lasted only minutes, but gradually extended to hours and, in severe cases, became permanent. One particularly well-documented case involved Judge William Harrington of Savannah, husband of the same Margaret Harrington who had warned Elizabeth at the slave auction. After smoking Mount tobacco during an evening gathering in April 1847, he excused himself, complaining of dizziness. When he returned to the parlor 30 minutes later, he addressed his guests in an unknown language. When they failed to respond, he switched to heavily accented English, identifying himself as Kwesi Addo, a warrior of the Ashanti people who had been captured in 1798 and brought to Georgia on a ship called the Mercy. The judge's knowledge of historical details he could not possibly have known, subsequently verified through shipping records, caused considerable consternation. More alarming was his absolute conviction that he was this other person, with no recognition of his actual identity or family. This transformation persisted for 3 days before he collapsed, awakening with no memory of the episode, but exhibiting a marked aversion to tobacco in any form. By summer of 1847, authorities had made the connection between these cases and Mount Plantation tobacco. The remaining stock was ordered destroyed, though rumors persisted that certain quantities had been secreted away by individuals who had witnessed its effects and seen potential for its use. A physician named Dr. Everett Chambers became so intrigued by the phenomenon that he established what he termed a research sanctuary outside Richmond, where he collected several affected individuals for observation. His notes, published posthumously in an obscure medical journal in 1852, proposed a theory that the Mount Tobacco had somehow become a conduit for the consciousness of enslaved Africans who had died without proper burial or ritual observance, their spirits seeking vessels through which to return and reclaim agency in a world that had stripped them of all autonomy. Chambers' research facility burned to the ground in October 1849 under mysterious circumstances. No patients survived. Chambers himself was found seated at his desk, physically unharmed, but in a condition identical to Elizabeth Mount's, alive but absent, his consciousness apparently displaced. The Mount Plantation property itself developed a reputation that persists in local folklore to this day. After the main house burned in 1850, several attempts were made to reclaim the land for agricultural use, all ending in failure. Crops planted there either failed to thrive or produced yields that caused sickness when consumed. Livestock refused to graze on the property, becoming agitated when forced onto the land. In 1893, a northern industrialist purchased the property at a fraction of its potential value, intending to construct a textile mill on the site. Excavation for the foundation uncovered a circular stone structure that predated the plantation, determined by archaeologists to be of both African and Native American design, suggesting a cultural exchange that historians had not previously documented in the region. When several workers disappeared after entering the structure, the project was abandoned. The land remained untouched until 1926, when a portion was designated for inclusion in a new county road. During initial surveys, 3 engineering teams independently produced maps showing completely different topographies of the same terrain. The project engineer, in his letter recommending an alternate route, wrote, "There is something fundamentally unstable about the Mount property. The land itself seems to resist our attempts to measure and define it, as though its true nature exists in a state of constant flux." The most scientifically rigorous examination of the property occurred in 1954, when a research team from Emory University conducted soil and water analysis throughout the area. Their findings, published in the Journal of Environmental Anomalies, documented several inexplicable features. Soil chemistry that changed from one day to the next, water samples containing organic compounds that spontaneously reorganize their molecular structure when observed under microscopes, and most bizarrely, audio recordings that captured whispered voices when equipment was left running overnight in certain locations, voices speaking in a mixture of English and various West African dialects. The team's lead researcher, Dr. Marion Prescott, noted in her private correspondence, later donated to Emory's special collections, "What we are observing defies conventional scientific explanation. The boundaries between living and non-living systems appear permeable here. The land itself carries memories, perhaps encoded through means we do not yet understand. Most unsettling is the sense that these memories are not passive records, but active influences. That the past is not truly past, but continues to exert will and purpose." In 1968, the final documented investigation of the Mount case was conducted by graduate student Thomas Harrison, whose disoriented state after attempting to camp on the property was mentioned earlier. His complete field notes, recovered from his abandoned campsite, contain observations made in increasingly erratic handwriting. The final entry, dated October 17, 1968, reads, 3:27 a.m., awakened by what sounded like a woman's voice, calling from the direction of the old foundation stones. Followed sound, moonlight sufficient for navigation without flashlight. Voice stopped, replaced by smell of tobacco, rich, sweet, unlike modern varieties. Reached clearing where foundation stones barely visible through vegetation. Woman standing in center. White dress, dark hair loose around shoulders. Approached slowly. She turned, face blank, eyes empty, but seeing nonetheless. Spoke single sentence. He has almost gathered enough vessels. As she spoke, felt presence behind me. Turned to find tall black man, amber eyes, scars on visible forearms forming patterns that seemed to shift when viewed directly. He smiled. Said, "Some debts can only be paid in kind. Some exchanges require equivalent value. Some justice transcends time." Reached toward me. His fingers elongated, became smoke, entered my mouth, nose, ears. Could feel something inside moving aside to make room. Last clear thought, I am becoming a vessel. Harrison was found 20 miles from his campsite, with no memory of how he had traveled such a distance on foot overnight. After his hospital evaluation, he abandoned his research, left the graduate program, and according to university records, relocated to West Africa. Correspondence from the American Embassy in Ghana confirmed that Harrison arrived in Accra in January 1969, but his movements after clearing customs were never traced. The most recent development in the Mount Plantation case came in 2003, when a tobacco company executive purchased several acres of the former plantation land, intending to establish an organic heritage tobacco farm specializing in heirloom varieties. Within months, the executive resigned his position, liquidated his assets, and established a foundation dedicated to tracing the genealogies of enslaved Africans and identifying their living descendants. When interviewed by the Atlanta Journal-Constitution about this dramatic life change, he offered a cryptic explanation. "I came to understand that some debts can never be repaid, but acknowledgement is the beginning of justice. The land remembers. The blood remembers. And those who were silenced have found new ways to speak. The foundation he established has, to date, helped more than 3,000 African-American families trace their ancestry to specific individuals who were enslaved in the American South. Each time a connection is confirmed, the foundation plants a tree on the border of what was once Mount Plantation, each one marked with a small ceramic plaque bearing a name, and under it the words, 'Remembered, reclaimed, returned.' Local residents report that on certain nights, particularly when the moon is full, these trees appear to shift positions slightly, gradually forming a pattern that can only be fully perceived from above. Satellite imagery captured in 2019 reveals that the trees now form a distinctive shape, one that anthropologists have identified as an Adinkra symbol from Ghana meaning "return and get it," a symbol associated with the reclamation of stolen power. As for Elizabeth Mount, her physical form remained institutionalized until her death in 1863. Hospital records indicate that in her final year she began to produce drawings, hundreds of them, created with whatever materials she could access. These drawings, preserved in the Georgia State Hospital archives, consistently depict the same image: a tall man with ritual scars standing in a field of tobacco, his form partially dissolved into smoke that flows into the mouths and noses of multiple smaller figures surrounding him. Her death certificate lists the cause as general system failure, but the attending physician noted an unusual detail. At the moment of death, her eyes, vacant for 17 years, suddenly focused, and she spoke her only recorded words since being found in 1846. "The exchange is complete, the debt paid, the justice begun." Isaiah Boone's ultimate fate remains undocumented in any official capacity. Yet throughout the South, in the decades following the Mount Plantation incident, stories persisted of an unusual presence, sometimes glimpsed as a tall figure with amber eyes, sometimes felt as an unexplained compulsion, sometimes manifesting as a distinctive scent of tobacco that preceded unexpected changes in fortune, particularly reversals in which the powerful suddenly found themselves powerless, and the subjugated discovered new avenues toward freedom. During the Civil War, Union soldiers reported encountering an unknown black man who provided detailed intelligence about Confederate positions, appearing and disappearing with inexplicable ease. Fleeing slaves spoke of being guided to safety by a figure who could walk through slave patrols undetected. After emancipation, several former slave owners in Georgia and South Carolina reported being visited in dreams by a scarred man who showed them memories of the brutalities they had inflicted, dreams so vivid that several sought out their former slaves to offer restitution. The last potential connection to Isaiah Boone appeared in 2017, when renovations to a historic building in Savannah uncovered a sealed compartment containing a leather-bound journal dating to 1872. The journal belonged to Rebecca Carter, a former enslaved woman who had established a successful healing practice after emancipation. In it, she documented visits from a man she identified only as the Vessel Keeper, who taught her about plants that could heal the body by first addressing the spirit. Her description matches earlier accounts of Isaiah: unusually dark skin, amber eyes, and ritual scarifications. She noted that he appeared physically unchanged despite the passage of decades, and that tobacco plants grew wherever he stayed for more than a night, even in soil that should not have supported them. The final entry in her journal, dated December 3, 1872, reads, "He says his work in this land continues but nears completion. The vessels are almost filled with what was stolen: dignity, identity, memory, power. When the exchange is complete, he will return home across the water, carrying with him the essence of those who stole so much from so many. A justice beyond the comprehension of their laws, but perfectly aligned with the deeper laws that govern all existence." He asked me to record these words. Let those who read this understand. No debt goes unpaid, no action without consequence, no theft without eventual restoration. The tobacco remembers, the land remembers, the blood remembers. And I am the keeper of that memory until balance is restored. Rebecca Carter's building now houses a museum dedicated to the history of African American healing traditions in the South. Visitors frequently report unexplainable phenomena: the scent of tobacco where none is present, whispered voices in empty rooms, and most commonly, unusually vivid dreams of lives they never lived in places they've never been. The Mount Plantation land remains vacant, marked on modern maps simply as protected wetlands. Development proposals are regularly submitted and just as regularly withdrawn after initial surveys produce contradictory or impossible results. The trees planted by the foundation continue to grow in their meaningful pattern, visible only from above. And occasionally, even now, residents of Chatham County report seeing two figures walking the perimeter of the old plantation boundaries at dusk: a woman in white with empty eyes and a tall man with amber eyes and ritual scars. Their forms, sometimes solid, sometimes dissolving into smoke that drifts toward the horizon, carrying with it the rich, sweet scent of tobacco and the whispered names of those still waiting to be remembered.